So, in light of the survey of the views, the one that we are going to go with is the one that good old Wayne Grudem gives us. And this is what he says. He says, man is like God and represents God. And I like this because he just seems to take the best of the views and he just kind of combines it into one. And he's saying two things here. And first, he's saying, man is like God. And he affirms the fact that, when God's created us in his image, he shared something about who he is with us. And so we can't exactly pinpoint what that quality is. One of it we know is our moral perfection, as God created us perfectly. He didn't create us fallen, but he created us as beautiful creatures. And so we are like God, and we can't ignore that element. But I love how Grudem doesn't ignore the functional component of that. He says we are not only like God, but we represent God. And I think you would completely miss the point in Genesis 1 and 2 if we forget this. Us being created in the image of God is so that we can reflect who God is to this world. And this truth about the image of God is really tied in closely with the Ten Commandments. When God says, just think about this for a second. When God says in the Ten Commandments, do not create images of God. Why is that? It's because God has already created that image of himself. It's us. We are that image. And so for us to create that image would be an abomination to our very own identity. And so we, being who we are called to reflect God and not make idols. And so when you look at idolatry, when we worship idols, it does violence to the very nature of who we are, because we, created in the image of God, are not to make images of something else, but we are called to reflect the beauty and the glory of God himself and worship God alone. And so I really like Grudem's definition, because he really captures the vocational element in man's call. And for us to reflect God, I want to propose to you that in order to reflect God, we need to worship God. And the reason is because we reflect what we worship. We reflect what we find beautiful. If I could illustrate this, and I apologize if you are coming from e-college, this might be familiar with you, okay? But if I could reflect this point that I just said, let's take this image. I found this from the internet. This is a street scene from South Korea, a very young, hip district called Hongdae, and here are these teenagers. I'm assuming they're just trying to, dance, and they drew a crowd. And when I look at what they dress and how they do their hair, and even just how they kind of position themselves with their legs apart like that, I could already imagine what kind of music they listen to. I would imagine they listen to something like this, right? When you look at that hairstyle, the clothes that they wear, it's very similar. I would guess, I would just judge them. If I saw on the street, hey, I think you listen to BTS or something, And, I would most certainly not suspect that they would be listening to this band, right? Because if they did, they most likely would probably look something like this. And so we already know intuitively that we begin to reflect and look like the image that we worship and adore. We become what we worship. We become what we worship. And that's why it is so important for us to not worship idols, but to worship God. Because as we worship God, whether we want to or not, we will inevitably reflect God. And so when God gives us this calling as the image of God to reflect God, we need to be very careful to be worshiping God, because without worshiping God, we cannot fulfill that vocation in our lives. And I just want to ask you, what image do you worship? Because even though we don't bow down before images of Baal or Marduk, culture gives us many images to bow down before. Culture gives us many images that we ought to worship and find beautiful, images to pursue. And if these are the things that we find most beautiful to us, we will strive to be like them. We will reflect them. And that's why God, because of the images that we worship that are not God, because of the idolatry that we commit, God has sent us his Son, who is called the perfect image of God. Hebrews 1:1 says he's the exact nature and imprint of the glory, of the radiance of God. And so God has sent his image to us so that we can see him for who he is. And as we look at him, we give worship to him. As we enjoy him, gaze upon his beauty, we become like him, and the image of God in us is restored. And I just want to ask you, have you been gazing at Jesus? And if you have, what has that Jesus looked like? Because Scripture presents a Jesus hanging on a cross, crucified to the world. And if this is the image of the Jesus whom we worship, the image that we will turn into is one similar to him. And, and so we see when God prohibits us from following after other gods, from making images, from worshiping idols, it is because it violates the core essence of who we are as images of God. It violates the vocation that God has given us. And so if I could summarize man's vocation into 3 points, I just want to do it like this. Man's vocation is first and foremost, it is to worship God. Man's first privilege in the temple, in the Garden of Eden, was to live and to behold God's presence. Man's first vocation is to worship God. And Genesis makes that very clear. What is the purpose of creation? Creation culminates, labor culminates to the seventh day worship. As God rests on his throne on the seventh day, all mankind is called to cease from his labor and bow down and give glory to his maker. And I just want to ask you, what is your attitude towards the Sabbath, towards Sunday worship? Do you view Sunday rest, Sunday Sabbath as something that's, for weaklings? Oh, I work 7 days a week. People who take a day off on Sunday, those are weaklings. What is your attitude towards the Sunday? Because your attitude towards Sabbath rest reflects your priorities in life. If your priority is to make money, is to make a name for yourself, of course you view rest as a waste of time, as something for weak people. If you view rest, Sunday rest especially, that lowly, most likely you do not prioritize the worshiping of God as the number one thing in your life. And so man's first vocation is to worship God. And I think the best heart check that we can do is examine our Sunday habits. Do we really cease from our labors to worship God? And is that resting about just playing around, going to the park, or is that resting about something so much more meaningful, which is to prepare my heart and to worship my Creator, to sing praise to him on Sunday worship with the community of God? And so that's the first thing. Man's vocation is to worship God. Second, man's vocation is to reflect God and to spread his glory. The image is not something that we privately enjoy, but we are commissioned by God to reflect that and to spread it to the ends of the earth. And it's so interesting how when God tells Adam to be fruitful and multiply and populate the world with images of who he is, Jesus in the Great Commission gives us something very similar. But he doesn't say be fruitful and multiply. He says what? Go and make disciples of all the earth, of all the nations. And so our vocation is to reflect the beauty and glory of God as we are like him. And lastly, man's vocation is to love neighbor. In Genesis chapter 9, in the book of Genesis itself, it gives us it draws out a moral application from the doctrine of the image of God. And this is what it says. It says, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. So based on the doctrine that man are created in the image of God, Genesis prohibits murder. And Jesus in Matthew chapter 5, he takes that a step further. He says, you've heard you shall not murder, but let me tell you, if you've hated anyone, you've murdered in your heart. And in Matthew 5:43, Jesus takes it another step further, and this is what he says. He says, you've heard to love your friends and family, to love your neighbors, but guess what? Who are your neighbor? Love your enemy. Love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. Why? So that you may be sons of your Father who are in heaven. When Jesus says you will be sons of your Father, he's saying you will be like your Father. You will bear the image of your God. And Jesus is the God who revealed the Father. And what kind of love did Jesus have? Jesus loved the world with a love that hated his enemies. Jesus loved those who strung him up on that cross. And likewise, as followers of Jesus Christ, we too are called to love our neighbor. And that neighbor includes even our very own enemies. We are prohibited from slandering anyone. Culture says it's okay to hate your enemies. Culture says it's okay to make fun of your elected leaders and whatever, but we are prohibited from any of that. We are called to give special dignity to human life because it is precisely the image of God. And so with that, those are the implications of the image of God as it relates to our vocation as people.